The world believed Princess Diana's fortune would vanish into the royal vault after her death. They were wrong. When executors unsealed her will in 1997, they discovered something the palace never anticipated.
Most people think they know the story of Princess Diana, the shy kindergarten teacher who became the most photographed woman on Earth, the reluctant royal who captured the world heart, the mother who danced with her sons in palace hallways and held dying strangers in hospital wards. People think they know how her story ended, too. A tragic crash in a Paris tunnel, a world in mourning. Flowers piled so high outside Kensington Palace that the scent hung in the air for days. But there is one chapter of Diana's story that almost nobody knows completely, and it involves what she did with everything she owned, everything she had built, and everything she believed in. When Diana sat down to write her will, she made a decision so unexpected, so deliberately unconventional, that it quietly upended the assumptions of the royal establishment, confused her closest advisors, and sent shockwaves to the British monarchy that are still being felt today. She left the control of her estate not to a family member, not to a senior counselor, not to one of the blue-blooded confidants the palace would have approved of, but to one single person who has stood quietly in the background of her life for years. And understanding why she made that choice reveals something profound about who Diana really was, what she truly feared, and what she was determined to protect long after she was gone. To understand the will, you first have to understand the woman who wrote it. Diana Frances Spencer was born on July 1st, 1961, at Park House on the Sandringham Estate in Norfolk. She was the third daughter of Viscount Althorpe and Frances Roche, and from the very beginning her life was shaped by a particular kind of aristocratic loneliness. Her parents divorced when she was just 7 years old, a separation that was messy, public by the standards of their social circle, and deeply painful for the children involved. Diana later spoke about standing at the end of the driveway, watching her mother drive away, not fully understanding why the family had shattered. That wound never entirely healed. It taught her something early, that the people and institutions you are supposed to trust most can leave without warning, and that the rules protecting powerful families rarely protect the most vulnerable people inside them. She was 20 years old when she married Prince Charles on July 29, 1981. In a ceremony at St. Paul's Cathedral that an estimated 750 million people watched on television around the world. She wore a gown with a 25-foot train. The bells rang. The crowds cheered. By every outward measure, it was a fairy tale arriving on schedule. But Diana would later describe the period leading up to the wedding with words that were far from romantic. She spoke of anxiety, of intuition telling her something was wrong, of a sense that she was walking into something she did not fully understand. She was right. The marriage was troubled almost immediately. Charles maintained his emotional connection to Camilla Parker Bowles, and Diana found herself isolated within a palace structure that was not designed to support a young woman's emotional needs. The institution expected performance. It did not offer comfort. What followed is well documented, but worth revisiting with fresh eyes, because the experiences of those years are the direct foundation of the decisions Diana made in her will. She developed bulimia nervosa, a condition she later discussed openly and courageously, describing it as her attempt to assert some form of control when everything else felt beyond her reach. She struggled with depression. She reached out for help and was largely met with institutional silence. The palace's approach to her suffering was, at its core, one of management and containment rather than genuine care. She was expected to fulfill her public duties, smile for the cameras, and keep the private turmoil invisible. She did for a while. But Diana was paying attention to everything happening around her, and she was quietly forming conclusions that would eventually become the most radical document she ever produced. Her public transformation during the 1980s and early 1990s is one of the most remarkable personal evolutions in modern history. Diana began to understand that her position gave her access to people and places that were normally shielded from royal attention, and she used that access in ways that broke with every established precedent. In April 1987, she visited an AIDS ward at Middlesex Hospital in London and shook hands with patients without wearing gloves. This was not a minor gesture. At the time, public fear and misunderstanding about HIV and AIDS was so severe that many people believed the virus could be transmitted through casual contact. Patients were being shunned by their own families. Diana's decision to touch them, to sit with them, to look them in the eye, and treat them with dignity sent a message that was heard around the world. It did not come from a press office. It came from her. In January 1997, just months before her death, she traveled to Angola with the Halo Trust, walking through active minefields to draw international attention to the devastation caused by landmines. She wore a simple visor and protective vest and walked slowly through fields where the ground could kill her. The images were extraordinary, and the impact was immediate. Political pressure mounted. Later that year, in December 1997, the Ottawa Treaty banning anti-personnel landmines was signed by 122 nations. Diana did not live to see the signing ceremony, but the campaign she amplified with her body and her presence contributed directly to that outcome. By the time she was negotiating the terms of her divorce and thinking seriously about her legacy, Diana had already demonstrated that she understood power better than most people who had spent their entire lives inside it. She knew that attention was a resource. She knew that vulnerability, deployed with intention, could shift public consciousness. And she was starting to think very carefully about what would happen to everything she had built when she was no longer around to protect it. The divorce from Prince Charles was finalized in August 1996. Diana received a settlement reported to be in the range of £17 million, along with the continued use of her apartments at Kensington Palace. She retained the title Princess of Wales, but lost the style of Her Royal Highness, a distinction the palace made with deliberate precision. She was no longer, in the institution's formal language, a working member of the royal family. She was free, but that freedom came with a particular vulnerability. She no longer had the full weight of palace infrastructure behind her, but she still lived under the intense scrutiny that came with being one of the most recognizable people on the planet. In the months following the divorce, she began the careful work of deciding what she wanted her legacy to look like. She revised her will in June 1993, and the document she produced was, by any standard, extraordinary. According to reports and accounts that have emerged over the years, the estate was divided with a structure that reflected her deepest values. The majority of her assets, estimated by various sources at around £17 million when accounting for jewelry, property interests, personal possessions, and financial holdings, was directed primarily toward charitable causes that had defined her public life: the work on HIV and AIDS, the campaigns around landmines, children's charities, organizations supporting people who had been marginalized or forgotten by the systems that were supposed to protect them. These were not token gestures. Diana was committing the substance of her financial legacy to the causes she had championed with her body and her reputation while she was alive. Her two sons, William and Harry, were provided for through trust arrangements that would give them access to funds at appropriate ages. She was not leaving her children without resources, but she was also not simply handing them uncomplicated wealth. The structure of what she left them reflected something she had clearly thought about with great care. She wanted to protect them financially, while also protecting them from a particular kind of distortion that comes with inherited power and unchecked entitlement. She had watched what that distortion could do. She had lived inside it. And then there was the executor, the person she chose to oversee all of it, to manage the trusts, direct the charitable distributions, and ensure that her wishes were carried out as she had written them. Not as the palace might have preferred them to be carried out, not as the media might have wanted to frame them, but as she intended. She chose Paul Burrell. Paul Burrell had joined the royal household as a footman in 1976 and had eventually become Diana's personal butler. Over the years that followed, he became something more than an employee. He was present during some of the most difficult periods of her life. He was in the house during the arguments and the silences that followed them. He saw her at her most exhausted and her most determined. He made tea in the early hours of the morning when she could not sleep. He was, by most accounts from people who knew both of them, genuinely devoted to her. Diana reportedly called him her rock. That word is worth sitting with. Not her solicitor, not her financial advisor, not a member of her own family. Her rock was a man who had spent his career in service, who had no formal power of his own, and who was therefore entirely outside the network of institutional interests that Diana had spent her adult life navigating and distrusting. The choice was deliberate, and it was strategic. By naming Burrell as executor, Diana was ensuring that the person interpreting and implementing her final wishes would be someone whose loyalty was to her personally, not to any institution, family line, or political interest. She was building a firewall between everything she owned and everyone who might want to redirect it. The consequences of that decision played out publicly and dramatically in the years after her death. Diana died in Paris on August 31st, 1997. She was 36 years old. The global outpouring of grief was unlike anything most living people had ever witnessed. Within days of her death, questions began circulating about her estate, her wishes, and who would control the narrative of her life going forward. Burrell's position as executor placed him at the center of considerable tension. In 2001, he was arrested and charged with stealing more than 300 personal items belonging to Diana, including clothing, letters, and other personal effects. The trial began in October 2002 and became one of the most closely watched legal proceedings in recent British memory, not because of the items themselves, but because of what they represented. The items in question were pieces of Diana's private world, letters, photographs, possessions that carried the texture of her actual life rather than her public image. Whoever controlled them controlled a piece of her story. The trial collapsed in November 2002 when Queen Elizabeth II told prosecutors that she recalled Burrell informing her, shortly after Diana's death, that he had taken certain items for safekeeping. The charges were dropped. Burrell was cleared. But the episode had illuminated something that many people had not fully appreciated before. The contest over Diana's legacy was real, ongoing, and being fought to the things she had left behind. In 2003, Burrell published a memoir titled A Royal Duty, which drew on his years of close proximity to Diana and his knowledge of her private life, thoughts, and wishes. The book was controversial. Members of the royal family reacted with fury. Prince William and Prince Harry released a joint statement, saying they were deeply upset by the publication. The palace characterized it as a betrayal. But Burrell consistently maintained that he was doing what Diana had asked him to do, keeping her voice alive, ensuring that her truth was not buried under the official version of events. Whether one views Burrell's choices after Diana's death as honorable or self-serving, and reasonable people have taken both positions over the years, the underlying dynamic he was navigating was one that Diana had anticipated and, in a real sense, engineered. She had understood that after her death, there would be powerful forces with strong interests in shaping how she was remembered. The palace had a version of Diana preferred, the troubled but ultimately manageable princess who had caused disruption, but whose legacy could be smoothed into something decorative and unthreatening. Diana's will was, in part, a structural argument against that outcome. By concentrating executive authority in a single person who was personally loyal to her, she created a single point of resistance that the institution could not easily dissolve through committee decisions or legal maneuvers. By directing the majority of her assets toward charitable causes rather than family inheritance, she made it significantly harder for anyone to claim that her estate was fundamentally a royal asset that should be managed according to royal priorities. She had thought through the vulnerabilities in her position, and she had addressed them with the tools available to her. The deeper significance of Diana's lies not in the specific figures or the specific names, but in what those choices reveal about her understanding of power and legacy. She was a woman who had entered one of the most powerful institutions in the world as a 20-year-old and had spent the next 15 years learning, at considerable personal cost, exactly how that institution worked and what it would do to protect itself. She had watched it manage her pain, contain her voice, and attempt to minimize her influence. She had also watched it fail to fully anticipate the way that public affection and media attention could become forms of power that operate outside the institution's control. Her will was the final expression of everything she had learned. It directed her resources toward the causes she believed in, protected her sons from both financial vulnerability and institutional manipulation, placed the keys to her legacy in the hands of someone whose loyalty was personal rather than political, and ensured that the story of her life would not be easily absorbed back into the narrative the palace wanted to tell. Diana did not simply leave an estate. She left a position, a set of standing instructions about what to do with her life's work and who should be trusted to carry them out. In a world where powerful institutions routinely outlast and outmaneuver the individuals who challenge them, she found a way to extend her challenge past her own lifetime. More than 25 years after her death, the implications of those choices are still unfolding. Her sons have lived complicated lives in the shadow, and sometimes a direct beam of everything she set in motion. Harry's eventual departure from royal duties, his relocation to the United States with Meghan, his public statements about the institution's treatment of him and his wife. None of these things are simple replays of Diana's own rebellion, but all of them bear the unmistakable marks of having been raised by a woman who taught, by example, that you do not have to accept the terms the institution offers you. The charitable work Diana funded and inspired continues. The landmine campaigns she championed have resulted in the clearance of millions of mines from former conflict zones. The conversation she opened around HIV and AIDS helped shift public perception in ways that save real lives. The organizations she supported have continued their work, funded in part by the foundation she established and the awareness she generated. And the questions she left behind about transparency, about the relationship between the monarchy and the public, about the rights of individuals within powerful institutions, remain genuinely alive and genuinely contested. They were not resolved by her death. In some ways, they were amplified by it. Diana understood, perhaps better than anyone around her, that the most important thing she could leave the world was not money or property, or even a carefully crafted narrative. It was the integrity of her actual choices. Choices made not for appearances, but out of genuine conviction, even when those choices were difficult, and even when they cost her something real. Her will was the last of those choices. And like the handshake in the AIDS ward and the walk to the minefield, it said something true about who she was and what she believed the world should look like.